Hey, what's going on, patrons? It is Friday, so you know what that means. It's another edition of Mosher's Mailbag, where I answer your questions. Didn't get as many questions this week as last week, but that's all right because the ones we got were good. So before I start to answer them, I want to give you just a little bit of my thoughts on Sunday's matchup. Obviously, the Eagles will be playing the top-seeded New Orleans Saints for the chance to go back to the NFC Championship game, which will be in either Dallas or will be in LA, whoever wins that game. I tend to think the Cowboys are going to win, but we'll see. So my thoughts on the game are like this. I think last week I shared with you that I saw the 3-6 matchup, the Bears-Eagles matchup, as a lot like the year before's, where the year before the Rams were the 3 seed. They were on a first-year coach, offensive-minded coach. They were on a second-year quarterback, Jared Goff, and they took the league by surprise. They had 7 more wins than the year before, and so they made it to the playoffs as a 3rd seed and surprised a lot of people, played a 4th-place schedule, but they lost in the first round against an Atlanta team that was in the Super Bowl the year before, kind of struggled during the middle of the season. They were 500, and then they got hot at the end of the year and made it into the playoffs, went out to LA, and they were the more experienced team. They were the better team at the time, and they won. And that reminded me a lot about this matchup last week. I mean, between the Eagles and the Bears. The Bears were an offensive-minded first-year head coach, a second-year quarterback who had just come into his own in the system. They were home. They had benefited from a 4th-place schedule. They had won 7 more games than the year before. They literally were the Rams from the year before. They were just a more defensive team than an offensive team. But the Eagles, who were in the Super Bowl the year before, like Atlanta was the year prior, went in, and obviously they won a game, and by the skin of their teeth, but they won it. I think the parallel still remains the same because 2 years ago, or last year, I should say, after Atlanta went on the road and upset the 3-seeded Rams, then they came to Philadelphia and they lost a very, very close game. You all remember here at the Link, had a chance to win it there at the end, but Julio Jones didn't catch the ball, and the rest is history. The Falcons played a great game, but the Eagles won. They were the best team in the NFC all year, and then that was a springboard for Nick Foles and the rest of the team to go on their Super Bowl run. So unfortunately, I kind of see a same parallel again, where the Eagles now are coming off that upset of the 3 seed. Now they travel to New Orleans to take on a team that's been the best team in the NFC and maybe the best in the NFL all year. And what I see is a very good game. I think both teams are going to move the ball really well. But in the end, I do think that the New Orleans Saints are going to win. I think that their talent is going to win out. And although I think it's going to be a very good game, and I would take the Eagles getting 8, which I think is what the spread is right now, I would take the Saints to win the game. So I think it'll take certainly a lot more than, what they gave against Chicago, which was an unreal ability to win a game despite turning the ball over twice, not getting any turnovers, and rushing for less than 100 yards to be able to edge out that win and stay hot. Will it surprise me if the Eagles win? Absolutely not. I'm not saying just because I think the Saints will win that the Eagles don't stand a chance. Exactly the opposite. I do think it's going to be a very good game. I do think both teams are going to move the ball extremely well. And I just think the Saints will probably make a few more plays in the end. So before I get to the questions, I want to remind you guys of another thing. I've recently started up a new show, a podcast with Brian Westbrook, Eitan Shander, Crystal Rich, and Roxy Romeo, a couple of Philadelphia music and sports celebrities, and obviously Brian Westbrook. So it's called For the Record. For the Record with Brian Westbrook. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. You can find it on Stitcher. You can find it on Google, all the podcast homes. And if you want to check out some of the visual elements of the show, promotional elements, you can find it on YouTube. Just search For the Record with Brian Westbrook, and you'll see it. It's a fun show because it's a sports talk show that branches out into other topics. We talk life, music, culture, everything. I mean, it's mainly a sports talk show, but we drift off into some other topics. So that makes us a little bit different than sports talk radio. And Brian Westbrook is hysterical. So you need to see it just to see how funny Brian is. And Eitan Shander, Crystal Rich knows so much about sports and the Sixers. She's amazing. Roxy Romeo, who does the morning show at Power 99, really entertaining person, kind of knows a lot more about music and culture than some of us, and she gets to school us. So I would encourage you to check it out. For the Record with Brian Westbrook. And of course, I'm still doing the Inside the Birds podcast with Adam Kaplan and Billy Osborne, which I post here on Patreon, and I will continue to. And you can find that with under Go Birds on all the podcast networks and 94WIP.com under podcast Go Birds, and you'll find the Inside the Birds podcast. All right, I've bored you with enough of that. Let's get ready to answer your questions. These are really good questions this week. Some of them have made me think deeply, which I try to do every once in a while. But the first one comes from Frank G, and he asks a question that's been on everybody's mind. And I think somebody asked me this last week in similar form or fashion. But with each week and each win that the Eagles have, it kind of becomes a little bit more of a question. And Frank asks, is there any momentum building inside the NovaCare complex to keep both Carson Wentz and Nick Foles? And he also asked me if there are now potential trade scenarios involving Carson Wentz. All right, first thing we need to say is that the team right now is so focused on the playoffs that, very few people in the building and very few people who I have as sources are dialed in onto what's going to happen 3 weeks from now or, a couple of days from now when their season's over. I mean, they're really locked in on the playoff run. Anything that you're hearing reports, as far as trades or how they're feeling, that might come from Jeffrey Lurie or Howie to a certain, person or people in the media that they're close with. But peripheral people around the league, I mean, they're not around the team right now are just focused in on the playoffs. So I don't know if there's any momentum building right now because momentum is only as good as your next game. And if Nick Foles goes out against the New Orleans Saints and doesn't play very well, I don't even think there's a discussion about who they're keeping moving forward. I don't think right now there is. It's Carson Wentz, but obviously if Nick can beat New Orleans and go on and maybe win the NFC Championship game and a Super Bowl, the more he wins, the more it has to become a question for the Philadelphia Eagles. And that doesn't mean that they have to, if he wins another Super Bowl, they have to trade Carson and go ahead with Nick Foles, but it has to become part of the conversation. And they really have to then start to weigh, what kind of offers they would get or how long they think they can keep Nick and vice versa. So there's a lot to say that. One thing that's been talked about is the idea of franchising Nick Foles and keeping him around one more year. That's not going to happen. They might franchise tag him and they may look to trade him, or they may, and I think this is the most unlikeliest scenario ever, they franchise Nick Foles and trade Carson Wentz. But if they do franchise Nick Foles, that will be an attempt to trade him. There is no possible way, unless Carson suffers another injury while not playing, or unless his 2019 season is jeopardized in some way or another within the next 2, 3, or 4 weeks, or before all the offseason transactions happen, there's no way that Nick Foles and Carson Wentz are going to be on the same team next year. You can't have Nick Foles making $20 to $25 million just to be a really expensive insurance plan again, and have Carson Wentz there with Nick. Every pass, every play that doesn't work well, there'll be people calling for Nick Foles. And just economically, it doesn't make sense, especially if the Eagles plan to give Carson Wentz a contract extension this offseason and, make him one of the, top 10, top 5, top paid quarterbacks in the league. But the idea that they wouldn't do that and then would keep Nick as a $25 million backup, or even start Nick and just get one more year of Carson as a backup. No, that's not happening. That's not how you handle a quarterback situation well. I get some people have so much love for both that they want to figure out any possible way that can happen, but it can't. There will not be Carson Wentz and Nick Foles on the 2019 Philadelphia Eagles roster. I've never felt so confident in saying that ever in anything. So that is I firmly believe to be true. Can they trade Nick Foles? They can if they franchise tag him. That would prevent him from walking away, which Nick can do if he opts out of his contract. The problem is when you franchise tag Nick, he's now on a 1-year, $25 million deal. So if you're trading for Nick Foles, per rules of the franchise tag in the CBA, you can't renegotiate a deal with a guy who is playing under the franchise tag. So unless you negotiate it before a certain deadline, you can't. So it would be very hard. You acquire Nick Foles. It's a 1-year deal. If you can't work out an extension, and in that case, he could leave at the end of the year, or you can use the franchise tag on him again for year 2, and that's about that. So if you play under the franchise tag for a second straight year, you make 125% of what you made the year before. So if he makes 25 million next year and then he's refranchised again, then you got to pay him what, 30 to 31 million the year after. So now you've got 2 years, 55 million of Nick Foles, and all of it's guaranteed. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And the type of team that you would think would acquire Nick Foles is the type of team that is trying to win now and has a lot of other pieces in place, maybe like the Giants. And I don't know if they have the cap space to be able to take that on without making a lot of other moves that may lessen the team. So we will go through 100 different scenarios involving both Nick Foles and Carson Wentz in the offseason. Is it possible Carson Wentz gets traded? I'll just say this. Be careful about the idea of getting multiple first-round picks for Carson Wentz. The Oakland Raiders traded Amari Cooper and they traded Khalil Mack, and they both got first-round picks. And at the time of those trades, those looked like great first-round picks for the Raiders, even though I thought they were both terrible trades. At least they were getting what you thought were high first-round picks. They traded Khalil Mack to the Bears. They had 4 wins the year before. Nobody thought that they were going to win 12 games this year, right? That high first-round pick now is a low first-round pick. They traded Amari Cooper to the Cowboys for a first-round pick that at the time the Cowboys had a losing record, I believe. It looked like they would finish in 3rd place in the NFC East. You might get a top 15 pick out of it. Now it's a bottom 10 pick. So in trading 2 all-pro caliber players, the Oakland Raiders got back 2 very low first-round picks. And I love picks. I'm a big draft value guy, but low first-round picks in the 20s to 30s, you're talking about guys who, at best become good players. You don't always find a lot of Pro Bowlers in there. Percentage-wise, your Pro Bowl players come in the top 10, and then there's a big drop-off after that. Nelson Aguilar has been a really good player, right? He went 22nd overall, if I'm not mistaken. If the Raiders get a player like Nelson Aguilar, then they didn't get a player that's going to be as productive for them as, say, Amari Cooper was, right? Or Amari Cooper is for the Cowboys. Same thing for pass rushers. You can go down and find good pass rushers in the bottom of the first round, but you can find more guys who are just adequate or not so good. Certainly not a lot of Khalil Mack. So you would have to trust the Oakland Raiders scouting department to really make, an unbelievable picks. And by the way, it's led by Mike Mayock now. They would have to really find diamonds in the rough to be able to get the type of talent in the low 20s that they gave up. So you trade Carson Wentz to some team, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, I don't know, and that you get a couple of first-round picks, and you're thinking, well, I just got 3 first-round picks. Well, what happens if that team that you trade Wentz to really benefits from having Carson Wentz, and those first-round picks are 23, 26, 27? Then you got, you're stuck for the next few years, potentially, depending on how things would go, how long you kept Foles, but you'd be stuck not so many years later after that looking for another Carson Wentz. So just when you talk about picks and everything, don't get so excited. You have to kind of look at the broader context of it. All right, last question came from Griffith T, and he asks about confidence level in the secondary, Eagles secondary against the Saints here in this matchup. And then he also asks about Avonte Maddox getting burned on double moves against the Bears. And it's a legit concern, and I'm pretty sure during the 4th quarter of that Eagles-Bears game that Drew Brees and Sean Payton were texting each other back and forth, all different types of formations that involve double moves along the sidelines to test Avonte and Maddox. So the one thing you could say is this secondary is playing a lot better than it was the first time they played the Saints. I think one of the bigger differences is that Corey Graham doesn't have to play every single snap as the deep safety. You've seen Trey Sullivan kind of splitting times with him. Trey is younger, starting to really, very athletic. He's starting to really find his niche in the Eagles defense. He's not perfect by any stretch of the means. He's not Ed Reed, but anytime you can take Corey Graham, who's 34 years old, and not have to play him, 50, 60 snaps, and you cut that down, that's a big win for the Eagles, and it's an advantage for the Eagles in that regard. Trey only played 6 snaps in the first game as Corey Graham played a lot. Now they rotate a lot more. And obviously the other big difference is that game, Sidney Jones was a starter on the outside and Rasul Douglas was a starter on the outside. Rasul was struggling at that point. Sidney was struggling both to stay healthy and in coverage. That was his first game, moved to the outside. Sean Payton, you saw, targeted him not only in the pass but in the run. He would run to that side, and he had said after that he felt that Sidney Jones' tackling was a liability, so they went after it. You look at where they're at now. They'll be starting Rasul Douglas on one side, the right side, right cornerback, and left cornerback will be Avonte Maddox, we just discussed. These guys are physical players. They're tough players. Drew Brees and Peyton, they can try to run to one side and try to get these guys isolated a little bit, but they're good, sound, fundamental tacklers, and they've been playing much better in that area. Now, as far as coverage, obviously, I think that someone's going to struggle with Mike Thomas. Mike Thomas is going to get the ball 8 to 10 times, no matter what you do. The Eagles will probably double him, and they'll probably, again, use Malcolm Jenkins to cover Kamara a lot in man situations. But I do suspect that in 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6, 3rd and longs, if they're able to force the Saints into 3rd and longs, Jim will play more of a cover 2 look. Usually he's a cover 1 guy with Malcolm in the box and playing that rover where he's in the middle of the field. But in the last few games, in obvious passing situations, you have seen more 2 deep safety looks, which allows both corners to have safety help and funnels inside. So I think the big coverage deal for the Saints is if you get 2 guys on Mike Thomas, if you get somebody on Kamara, then it becomes up to guys like Rasul Douglas and Crayvon LeBlanc in the slot to be able to handle guys like Traquan Smith and Keith Kirkwood and the tight ends. And the linebackers have to do a good job covering the tight ends. Breeze gets the ball out really quick. The big thing is that you want to prevent the big plays and you want to prevent the 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9 connections. Okay, that was something that killed them in the New Orleans game. They've been much, much better in 3rd down defense over the last few weeks, and they were very good against the Bears in it as well. So I think, and one thing that I've noticed about the New Orleans offense is that over the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season, they started to regress back to the mean a little bit. Whenever you're relying so heavily on basically 2 guys, Mike Thomas and Alvin Kamara, to be your entire offense, teams catch up to that, and they scheme around that. And the guys who killed the Eagles in that first matchup, Traquan Smith, I think Austin Carr, the tight end, Dan Arnold, guys like that, they weren't as productive over the last month of the season as they were during the Saints' 10-game winning streak. So those guys are going to be the ones that the Eagles have to cover in one-on-one situations, especially if they're doubling Kamara or doubling Michael Thomas. I think the Eagles are better equipped to do it this time around, but Drew Brees is a Hall of Famer for a reason. He finds those guys for a reason. But I do think that while both teams will be able to move the ball, you're not going to see a Super Bowl at 41-33. I think that both defenses are playing well, and I do think the Eagles secondary is in much better shape now to be able to limit big plays and to stop 3rd downs than they were when they met November 18th. All right, that'll do it for this week's Mosher's Mailbag. Man, 17 minutes. I hope that was insightful. Hope everybody has a great weekend, and we'll see. Maybe this week we'll be doing next week we'll be doing another mailbag and talking about an Eagles matchup in the NFC Championship. Have a great one, everybody.